Hi, everyone. Lynn from Dataiku here. Thank you so much for coming to today's webinar. While people are trickling in, I know we just got started, I'll tick off a few housekeeping items from the list, and then I will let Christina and Clémence take the stage, and we will get started with the main event. So first things first, you can sit back and relax instead of furiously taking notes. This session is being recorded. So we will send a follow-up email after the session with the recording, and all of you, everyone who signed up will have access, so no worries there. Secondly, definitely feel free to use the chat to say hi. I see some people already have. Hi everybody. For running commentary, things like that. We will use the chat back to send you any relevant documentation or other materials as we kind of go along. We do also have Maxine here from our product team on standby to kind of send any useful materials along. But if you do want to ask a question that you'd like the team to get to during the Q&A session at the end, please, instead of using the chat, do use the little question mark in the circle, that tab. Ask your question there so that we can keep better track of those questions and then make sure we get to them at the end. And other people can kind of upvote their favorite questions. It just sort of works better that way. Questions can sort of get lost in the chat. So without further ado, before I hand it off to Clémence and Christina, who will be your main hosts for today, just a quick preview as to what we'll be talking about. So here at Dataiku, we talk to customers and people every single day who have all sorts of questions about generative AI. Is it safe to use for my data? How will my IT team manage it? If I implement a GenAI use case, will people even trust it? So lots and lots of fears and worries, which will be the theme of this session. And so definitely, if you have specific themes, worries, definitely feel free to throw them in the chat. We all have them, and it would be interesting to kind of know what you guys are here for and kind of what your main worries are. And while you're doing that, I'll hand it off to Clémence, who will get started. And again, questions in the question part. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn. So we briefly showed some of the concerns raised by generative AI in enterprise. For ease of breaking this, we're going to go through 3 different sections in this presentation: readiness, development, and oversight. First, readiness. What do I mean here by readiness? I refer to the, let's say, safety framework that you will need to implement to start with generative AI in your company. So it covers the concerns that as an IT manager or a generative AI leader, you may have as you start launching generative AI initiatives in your enterprise. These concerns are diverse. There are questions, of course, linked to control and safety. How do I control who can access the different AI services purchased by the company? So often it may ring a bell. It starts by sharing some API keys with a bunch of data scientists, but you quickly realize that it doesn't allow for any control. Other question, how do I ensure that no sensitive data is sent to ATS services or without validation? How do I make sure that costs remain under control? How many of you were able or are able to estimate before exploring or experimenting with generative AI how much a basic application would cost? I think almost none of us. So overall, this could sum up to this question: how do I open the doors to generative AI in my company while keeping control over the way it is used? But you could also add to that another important type of concern: agility. As you all have noticed, we are in a very fast-changing ecosystem. So while this innovation is super stimulating for, I guess, almost all of us, it also raises one question: how do I make sure that the choices I make today, the architecture, the services I buy, the model I use, will be able to quickly evolve to incorporate the latest innovations, but also regulations? This is with all this concern in mind that we built the LLM mesh architecture. So what is the LLM mesh? The LLM mesh is the common backbone under all your generative AI applications. You could really see it as a gateway between, on one side, all your generative AI services, LLMs for tier providers, open source model from Hugging Face, vector stores, and on the other side, your end users, data scientists, developers, or business users. The goal of the LLM mesh is to secure the use of generative AI services while providing openness and flexibility. So I will quickly show you what it looks like in the product. Here I am on my Dataiku instance, on my admin panel. I can create new LLM mesh connections among a large choice of providers or even for open source models. OpenAI, Azure OpenAI, Bedrock, etc. Now, if I create a new connection, for example, OpenAI, what does it look like? So I can provide an API key. And then I can select the model that my end users will have access to when using this connection. I have information on costs of each of this model, on the pricing of each of these models, so that I can make informed decisions in the selection of my models. Then I can configure security settings. Who can access these connections? Who can use these models? Which group of users? I can configure caching to reduce costs if I have some similar requests sent to a model within the same range of time. And then, very important, I can configure auditing. What does it mean? It means that when a query is sent to a model via the LLM mesh, I can configure logging. So I can either log who made the request, which users, from which project, how long was the request, for example. But I can also decide to log the whole query and response in an audit dataset. And then finally, I can configure moderation layers on all the requests, the queries sent to models, and the responses, for example, toxicity, PII detection, or forbidden terms. If I go back to the slide, once a connection is configured, the models can be used in all our visual capabilities, from Studio, generative AI recipes, but Christina will say more about it later, but also with code using the LLM Mesh API, either from inside Dataiku or outside Dataiku. Now, before I hand it to Christina, please don't run away because I won't spend too much time discussing architecture, but just I would like to explain what's happening under the hood when a query is sent to a model via the LLM Mesh. So first, it gets filtered if configured. So for example, to detect PII elements in the query. Then it's routed either to a tier service or to self-deployed open source model from a interface. Then the response received from the model is filtered again, for example, to prevent toxic answers. And finally, before being sent back to the user, the answer and query are logged to allow for auditing and cost control. So with the LLM Mesh, you get full control and visibility over the use of generative AI models. Now I let Christina detail on the applications built on top of the LLM Mesh.
Thanks, Clémence. Let me share my screen. Okay, so we went through readiness, and let's say that now you have an operating framework in place. IT has selected some models that they want to make available to different builders and users. And now at this point, you might turn to considering which use cases you want to tackle and how you're going to enrich your existing business applications with GenAI. But at this point, you might be concerned with risks about sending proprietary or sensitive information outside the company to a third-party service. Or you may be looking at the architecture that Clémence just showed and feel that you don't have enough AI engineers who really understand the ins and outs of these complex models and how to integrate them. Or you might worry about how to anticipate or estimate those costs before the fact. So one best practice that we have is if you're just getting started with GenAI, it's a good idea to gain some LLM experience with back office use cases that give you really great efficiency gains. They improve productivity for your employees, but are still relatively low risk, as compared to, say, maybe an external customer-facing app that carries a bit more risk if the model doesn't perform exactly as you expected while you're learning. So as one example, Q&A chatbots are one way that you can dramatically cut down on the time that it takes for your knowledge workers. So when I say that, I mean people like your claims specialists, tech support agents, customer service reps, legal analysts, people like that, who spend a ton of time hunting down, retrieving, synthesizing information from disparate sources, and then feeding it back to maybe an external third party. So when you're doing that, you can still provide that human layer of validation from that research and discovery before creating that external facing answer. So that's one way to kind of reduce that risk, is use that back office internal chatbot. But you may be thinking at this point, okay, that's great. I'd love a chatbot to answer all my questions, but the answers that my tech support reps or my customer service agents need isn't found in information that an open model would know. Maybe the model was trained too long ago and I need more recent up-to-date information. Maybe I work in a really specialized domain like medical or manufacturing, where it's really complex stuff that model hasn't been trained on. Or maybe the information that you need your knowledge workers to respond with is not available at all because it's private. It's financial statements, it's individual customer policy documents, for example. So here's where techniques like retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, come into play. And you may have heard a lot about this technique. It's been in the news a lot. So I'm not going to go too much into the specifics of how it works behind the scenes, but essentially you can create a knowledge bank that contains the source information you want the model to draw from when answering your questions. So you can think of RAG kind of like this super efficient librarian who, when you ask a question, kind of instantly goes into this library that you've pointed it to, pulls out the most relevant books and the passages from those books, and provides it to the LLM at the moment when it's answering your question. And the LLM combines its existing knowledge with these substantiated facts from your own knowledge base. And it gives the answers back to you with the cited sources so that your knowledge workers can validate the answer. So this is a really great way to mitigate any risk you feel due to hallucinations. And it also fosters trust because of their cited sources, that the answer is correct. So if you're worried about sending your library kind of out to a public or an external API service, you can, for ultimate data privacy, choose to use self-hosted or local models. Maybe you've downloaded them from Hugging Face, so that everything from end to end stays behind your firewall. So that's one way that highly regulated industries are kind of doing these chatbots and keeping all their data inside, is using those self-hosted models. So another, let me go back up one. Oops. Another example of high value, low risk set of use cases could be modernizing traditional NLP pipelines. So let's say, for example, you have call center notes or you have survey responses, you want to do sentiment analysis or topic analysis, tag things for categories. Let's look at a project actually in Dataiku where we have an example, just to make this a bit more real. So here I'm looking at Dataiku's interface. You can see we have this data set of CRM data, and I think we have some sales notes. Yeah. So let's go ahead and find those notes. You can see here in every CRM interaction, we kind of write down what happened. This is pretty common. And let's say we want to do sentiment on these notes because we want to add a flag that we'll use downstream in a predictive model for whether these customers are likely to adopt our brands. Now, in the past, and when I say in the past, I mean like 2 years ago, not far past, but we might have either, worst case scenario, manual tagging workflows, or we might use a rules-based or even a conventional NLP approach that requires a lot of domain expertise to set up. So what we can do is we can actually use GenAI to just modernize this. And it's not just going to be faster and easier, it's also probably going to be better because these language models are really good at understanding nuance and context. Now in Dataiku, we've made some of these commoditized tasks even easier for business users. So you can see we can summarize this text if it's longer, we can classify it by topic, do sentiment analysis, and so forth. And so let me actually just kind of crawl across to the actual sentiment recipe we ended up using for this marketing project. And you can see here, I said, I want to do sentiment analysis on my sales notes. And here's where the models that Clémence was talking about come into play. So my IT group has approved certain models for use through the LLM mesh. And as a business user or a data scientist, I can just choose from that approved list. Okay. even the augmented models we talked about just a moment ago. So it's really easy. Downstream, I have now an output data set which contains new sentiment flags, positive, negative, neutral. Off we go. Further analysis, modeling, and so forth. So this is one way that you can kind of integrate GenAI into existing pipelines and projects with almost no effort at all and no code knowledge needed. Now, if your request is more custom than just sentiment analysis or summarization, you may need to engineer a tailored prompt to ask the LLM to perform your task. And you may think, okay, I don't have hundreds of prompt engineers on staff, people who know the intricacies of the exact query format each individual API service requires, since Bedrock, their requirements are slightly different than Azure OpenAI, which is different than Anthropic, for example. And you might be concerned about kind of hitting run without having any idea how much that job is going to cost your company when you run it on all your data. So one way that we've addressed these concerns is a built-in app that we built for our customers right in our product called Prompt Studios. So in this case, let's say our task is to write a marketing email that's personalized to each of those CRM targets' customer journey. And so we can try out different prompts here. We can test them on different models to see what the results look like. And best of all, I can see, it's kind of small here, maybe I can zoom in a little bit. You can see here the estimated cost for 1,000 records. And this is going to allow me to extrapolate how much this is going to cost at scale before I run it. So now Clémence showed kind of cost levers in the LLM mesh level. Now we have it even at the user level. And this helps me to make good trade-offs between performance and cost. Okay. So let's say that you are a little bit further into your journey. You've built some GenAI enhanced business applications, and now your concerns are more about oversight and monitoring because you've got a lot of moving parts. So you're going to want to think about what levels of scrutiny to apply. What does your company feel comfortable with when it comes to vetting GenAI projects to make sure they're following responsible AI principles, make sure there's a human in the loop somewhere. And so this is the time when you're going to want to cross-check with your compliance and risk guidelines so that you're adhering not just to internal policies, but also any regulatory compliance requirements that your industry or a geography might require. And you're going to need to think about a way to keep an eye on who's using the LLMs for what purpose and how much it's costing the company. So let's start with usage and costs. If you don't have a framework like the LLM mesh in place, it can be a little bit unwieldy to get a handle on all the jobs being sent to commercial API services like GPT or Azure OpenAI, for example, or easily track down who is the person who requested it and for what purpose. So as Clémence showed in that administrative panel, we have the ability to keep detailed audit trails for every request, and they can be used to power dashboards like this. And this allows us to see, who's using what LLM for what purpose, how much it's costing, how those costs are changing over time. These charts are all configurable based on what you want to see. And it's useful for rebilling internally. So for example, we might say the CRM chatbot is going to be paid for by the sales organization, but those emails for outreach might be paid for by the marketing department. And so this allows us to do that internal accounting as well. It's also quite common for teams to set up customized alerts so that operators will get an email or an instant message that maybe costs have exceeded some threshold or there's some kind of suspicious activity pattern emerging that we need to look at. So one other thing that I quite like is this estimated saved costs chart. Now, Clémence mentioned that we could do caching, I think. So this is a great way to reduce costs because for common questions, we can save those responses, to the cache. And so what we've done here is we've said, how many of the questions that have been asked before are we able to serve from our cache and not spend the money to re-ask the same question and get the same answer again? And this gives us a good way to get an ROI calculation right off the caching. Now, with the risks related to GenAI, it's also a good idea to implement some internal processes and policies so that your teams can ensure that kind of this responsible process is being followed. Think about which stakeholders should be assigned for review and sign off. So in Dataiku, one way that we do this is by automatically tagging any projects that include LLMs in our built-in AI governance framework. So in this user interface, you can see risk managers can very easily filter down to projects that use large language models to ensure the right levels of scrutiny are being applied. They can kind of look at the ones that are using external API services or self-hosted models to make sure that the use case for privacy lines up properly with those different types of models. And again, the framework also includes those workflows where I said you can say, okay, our IT needs to approve it. Risk and compliance needs to approve it. The business stakeholders need to approve it. These are different gates to enforce at different stages of the project. And finally, when it comes to validating generated content, you also are going to want to build in that process for human in the loop. Somebody should take a look at it. I mean, the responses look really good. And spot checking is, of course, what is very human, very natural for us to do, but it's not super scalable and it's not really traceable. And so one way that we recommend that our customers address this challenge is to use our built-in managed labeling framework. Now, originally, again, back before GenAI, this was mainly used to create large data annotation projects for, to get training data for deep learning or machine learning models. But now we see people also using it for post-hoc content validation. So for example, in this labeling workflow we're looking at here, we took those customer emails, personalized emails, and we're giving subject matter experts the chance to review a sample and either, accept them as is, this is good, or give feedback on the content and tone, or flag if any toxic or PII slip through the filters. Okay, so with that, I'm going to hand it back to Clémence to talk about what we're planning next in our roadmap.
Thanks, Christina. So I'm going to share my screen again. Okay. So before giving you more insight about where we are heading to, what's planned in the roadmap, I just wanted to do a brief wrap-up or summary of how we see enterprise-grade applications, generative AI applications, at Dataiku. So it all starts with the LLM mesh that will support and secure all your applications. These applications, they are composed of different components, prompt that you can design with our prompt studio, augmentation, and so on. All these building blocks are combined in agents, which are complex and intelligently orchestrated pipelines. So you can imagine either static pipeline or this pipeline orchestrated with an LLM. These agents, they are then exposed to end users via chatbot or directly, for example, embedded in existing applications. Finally, this is an important point for us. We strongly believe that to be able to go from a POC to an enterprise-grade application running in production, it needs to be fully integrated in an operationalization process. Operationalization, MLOps, XOps, has been a strong focus for us over the past years, and we are convinced that although it will come with some specificities for generative AI, for example, when considering performances for generative AI application, you may think of quality, but also safety and cost, because often it's a trade-off between performances and cost. So although it comes with some specificities, it will remain key in the success of your application to integrate the application in an operationalization process. Now I'll deep dive on our roadmap, first regarding the LLM mesh itself, and then regarding how we support, and we will keep supporting the development of applications built on top of the LLM mesh. So our LLM mesh roadmap, let's say, lies on three main pillars in our vision. First, more capabilities. We will keep extending the core capabilities of this gateway. Second, flexibility. Why? Because while the LLM mesh provides a structured framework for building all your applications, we really want to make sure that it remains as flexible as possible to suit your specific context. And finally, last pillar, monitoring and control. If you remember what I presented earlier, the goal of the LLM mesh is to secure and provide control over generative AI usage in your enterprise. Now, what does it mean in terms of features? It means, so it's not exhaustive, but it means, for example, extending the vector stores we support, supporting new types of model with multimodal models, so images as input and images as output, allowing for an easy integration of your fine-tuned model and also an easy deployment of your fine-tuned models. And now about control, it means several things. First, advanced and customizable moderation layers. If you remember the features that I showed you, PII, toxicity. So we want to increase the number of features we provide, but also allowing you to add your own policies through customizable moderation layers. And it also means reinforcing oversight over the use of generative AI in your company with monitoring dashboards and also overspending blockers to make sure that it doesn't get out of control. The costs are out of control. Now, let's look at what we're planning for supporting you in generative AI, in the development of generative AI application. So, if you remember the graphic I presented on the left, generative AI apps can actually be complex pipelines, combining some building blocks and agents delivered to a broad audience through generative AI-powered applications. First, we are enriching the building blocks that you will leverage when building your applications. So I talked about multimodal models. We will also add multimodal models to Consulio. We'll also offer visual tools so that it becomes easy for you to fine-tune models. Then on top of these building blocks, you will need to build these complex and smart pipelines, smart because orchestrated by an LLM. This pipeline that we call agents. For that, you will need tools and an easy way to build those agents. So we will provide first a library of LLM tools to leverage within agents all your enterprise intelligence. So you can imagine look up data sets, get prediction from a model or from a traditional ML model, and many more. And we also provide an agent studio to ease the development and deployment of agents. Then once your application is built, it needs to be made available to end users. So many options, either through web apps, for example, the chatbots, and we will continue to provide accelerators for building these web apps with templates. For example, to easily, in a few clicks, configure a chatbot. But you could also decide to directly expose these applications, these agents, in existing tools. For example, you could think of a chatbot directly integrated in your enterprise communication tools, like Slack, or in your customer service platform, for example. And we will work on facilitating these integrations. And finally, once your app is built, that's not the end of the story. To ensure trust and reliability, you will need to continuously evaluate your application. So evaluation for generative AI, what does it mean? It means different things. You may want to measure the quality of the answers, as well as the toxicity or biases. And we will provide the tools you need to evaluate your application on these different aspects: performances, safety, and fairness. With all these capabilities, you will be able to easily build powerful and secure generative AI applications with confidence. Thanks for listening, and I think now it's question time.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Clémence and Christina. We have a lot of great questions in the chat, and I know that Maxime has been hard at work answering some of them. So we had questions about all the connectors available with the LLM mesh, which he has provided a link there for all of you who want to know the answer to that question. There was also a question specifically about GPT-4, which of course we do support. So Maxime has also answered that. So definitely check out the answered questions to see those answers. But let's get some of the ones that we haven't answered, because there's some really good ones in here. And I think a good one to start with. There's a really great question from M. Daly, who says that he or she comes from a small organization just starting to explore GenAI. Can you describe when is the right time to get more sophisticated and use something like the LLM mesh?
Okay, I can go with that. I think the right time is as soon as you start actually experimenting with generative AI, because this say safety framework that we are proposing with the LLM mesh, I think it's relevant from experimentation to production. So even when you start, you can still think about implementing this framework, or it will be for sure useful for you to first start setting control, but also start measuring costs, as Christina said, and understanding what's happening, and yeah, with the different initiatives.
Thank you. We also have Ellen, who had the highest voted question, so we should get to it. He or she says, I love the example of sentiment analysis being generated from the CRM database. Focusing on that example, my question here is if you have more examples of business solutions that a sentiment analysis could achieve. It's not clear to me if you're speaking about Dataiku solutions or if you're just looking for generally examples of GenAI use cases that involve sentiment analysis, but I guess we could answer it both ways.
Yeah, I can take that one. So let's assume for starting point that we're talking about just different sentiment analysis can be useful from a business perspective. Quite commonly, what we see are people having lots of open-ended, free-form text coming from surveys where people have open-ended responses, or they have call center transcripts, product or service reviews from the website, or feeds coming in from social media, customer support care, for example. So when somebody tweets an airline, that could be one area where, all those different sources are areas where if you can kind of run it through a GenAI model very quickly to score it for sentiment, you then can triage it the appropriate way, because you might want to handle a very negative tweet or review differently than you handle somebody who's gushing about your product. So that's one very, very low-hanging fruit. Another could be things like news analysis for underwriting, for risk, for financial planning, and things like that. And so a lot of companies sort of scrape news feeds, run them through to summarize them, to identify sentiment, and that can really give you the pulse for sort of financial planning, market movement, and things like that. So sentiment analysis can be used almost anywhere that you have customer, like in the voice of customer text. And we do have, I think we put an answer in there. We have one example in our public gallery of a sentiment analysis analyzer project that you could take a look at. I think that one is actually using more of the conventional methods that I talked about, where you do NLP, you have, stemming and stop words, and you apply, you vectorize it and all that kind of stuff. Now you can replace it with that single recipe that I showed.
Whoops, I think I'm muted. We have the next top voted question from Lauren, and you covered this very briefly, Christina, but I think some people might have missed it. Can you give an example of why someone might want to use a self-hosted versus a public LLM?
Sure, I can cover this, or Clémence might also have a good perspective here. So I'll start. In general, I think the easiest solution is to use a commercial service. Because these models are evolving very fast, they're being trained on large data sets, they're really performant. And there's lots of different variations you can try and test and use from, and they're probably going to do a pretty good job. So that's the easiest thing, because it's just a service. You send them a question, you get the response. Now, the time when you might want to consider using a self-hosted or local, like a downloaded model, could be if you have security or privacy concerns. It's sensitive data that you don't want to send out, and you really don't trust it leaving the firewall at all, even to kind of a secure API like Azure OpenAI, right? If you have your data on Azure, in theory, they already have your data, but you might still want to keep it behind the firewall. Here's where you might consider doing a local model. But keep in mind there are trade-offs because now you have to host this model, and depending on which one you pick, it can be large. You have to have the GPUs. You need to have in-house expertise to know how to manage that model and set it up. So there's a bit of a trade-off in ease there. So Clémence, anything you want to add there?
No.
Okay. Hopefully that helped.
Yes, I think it did. We have a question from Juan Carlos, which is really around implementation of the LLM mesh. Are there any barriers to implementing it? How easy is it to implement? Maybe one of you could say a few words about just how people can get started.
So maybe I can take this one. As you may have seen, I showed the configuration screen, so it's quite straightforward, I would say. You can, on your Dataiku instance, you can start configuring very easily your connections. You provide your API key, you select the model, and then as soon as it's done, either, again, from using the API or using our visual components, your end users can start leveraging the LLM mesh. So I would say quite easy as soon as you have a Dataiku instance ready.
We do have a question about fine-tuning, which I don't think we have the time to get into in depth, but maybe to at least touch on this question a little bit, we could just touch on what is fine-tuning and kind of how that factors into the equation. I know that it's definitely something that when people talk about generative AI and large language models, that comes up. And so maybe we could just say a few words about kind of why someone might want to fine tune.
Is that, yeah, I can take this one. So you usually work with very broad models that can do everything. That's how they sell it to you. The thing is that in your day-to-day business activities, you might want to have a much more specialized model, and that's what fine-tuning is for. I'm talking here about learning a new task. For example, I don't know, extracting key information from documents or contracts or whatever. That's something that maybe a let's say base model will not know exactly how to do, but you can learn and you can teach it how to do that properly. And so, yeah, that's fine-tuning. Fine-tuning can be very, very interesting, especially when it comes to local models, because they are super small compared to GPT-4 and all those super, super large beasts. But well fine-tuned, they can become very, very powerful at, again, a specific task. And so we think that's a super interesting use case to look into and or actively working on that.
Thank you, Maxime. There was also an interesting question here about how can SMEs benefit from Dataiku solutions, so subject matter experts. Christina, did you want to speak briefly to this one?
Yeah, I do. And actually, Clémence, if you can stop sharing, I'll share my screen really quickly. What I wanted to mention is that if I'm understanding the question properly, for people who aren't beginners and really understand the space very well and are super interested in getting into the code and the intricacies, maybe doing fine-tuning, things like that, I did show a lot of the visual recipes because some people are just getting started, but we have so many things for our experts, for people who are comfortable in code, to be able to incorporate LangChain, to be able to build flows that include agents and do pretty complex things with multimodal AI and cutting edge things. So on our public gallery, I have the gallery open, but we have lots of examples that you can go to of GenAI projects that have code elements. And I'm going to show you just one here that I had open. Here, if we just pop into like one of these Python recipes, you can see experts, SMEs have the LLM mesh framework in place. It's as simple as, again, putting the LLM ID in. So you don't still need to do all the more difficult work of kind of configuring each individual LLM and then swapping it out when you want to try a different one. That's where the mesh still helps even our experts, but you can custom code everything else you like. We have code samples for almost everything that you want to do, for RAG, for all these types of things in our developer guide. So I definitely encourage you not to write off Dataiku as a solution if you are an SME and an expert in GenAI.
Thank you. And yes, I did realize halfway through that maybe by SME you meant small, medium enterprise. So please do specify if that's not what you meant on this question. But we can definitely follow up later if that is not what you were asking. I think we have time for one last question. And Clémence, I think this one is for you. Our top voted question is, how can we test and validate the response authenticity of LLM models?
Yes, thanks. So actually, this is a complex topic and challenging topic, being able to validate the answer. So actually, there are different levels of answer. Hallucinations is a tough one because finding and identifying hallucinations from a standard model is quite complex. What can be done is when we are doing RAG, retrieval augmented generation, the way you can validate the answer of a model is to compare if the answers is, or at least to look at if the answers is taking into considerations the context that was retrieved. So this can prevent, for example, from, or at least allow to identify hallucinations in the context of RAG. Then there are many metrics that you can use, broader than hallucination, to define the quality of your answers. So it can either use statistical methods, or what is being more and more common, which are LLM as a judge metrics. When you ask another LLM to evaluate the answer of your first applications along some criteria. So these are the different methods that are being, I think, tested and explored on the market. We will work with Dataiku to provide you some out-of-the-box metrics for your pipelines, customizable also.
Wonderful, thank you. I think that's all we have time for today. Again, would really like to thank Maxime, Clémence, Christina for being here, for answering everyone's questions. And thank you everybody for coming. It was great to have so many questions in the chat. We will follow up with the recording. And of course, if you have any other questions, you can contact us through our website, dataiku.com. And if you would like more information about generative AI features, we will also in our follow-up send along a link where you can check out further videos about the LLM mesh. And you can also subscribe to our newsletter to get updates, product updates, updates about generative AI, about LLMs, about everything we do at Dataiku. And hopefully we will see you virtually very soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.